When one thinks of large plushmobiles, thoughts often conjure up of Cadillacs, Lincolns, and American luxury vehicles of, let's say, the 1950s through the 1970s. These cars were enormous, especially by the time the mid-1970s rolled around, had huge engines, slurped tons of fuel, but they were arguably the best at delivering upon their mission, which was a completely isolated ride. The handling was soft, the steering was effortless, and effectively every control that you touched, whether it was the power window switch or the accelerator or the brake, required minimal effort in order to keep the driver refreshed on long trips, which is what a lot of people did back then. Now, however, we're going to talk about a vehicle that you may not have heard about, and this is a plushmobile from down under, and that is the 1976 Ford LTD P6 town car. Yes, that was an absolute mouthful, but wait till you see this vehicle that blends English styling and American flair and was sold in Australia. Now, what was the genesis of this Ford LTD P6 town car? Well, in 1973, Ford Australia began building Fairlane-based LTDs, and previous to that, they had really sourced U.S. cars in the event that somebody wanted a large vehicle, with some exceptions, of course. But by this point in 1976, Ford Australia was churning out a number of large, full-size cars and selling them relatively successfully in the local marketplace. This P6 LTD was introduced in the fall of 1976, and it was based upon the ZH Ford Fairlane that you can see here with a lot of typical Ford styling cues, probably even from a few years earlier. Think about a 1974 Ford LTD in the U.S. as an example seen here, and now look at the Ford Fairlane ZH, and you can see the front end looks pretty similar. The hood has that kind of prow in the middle of it, and the front section, the header panel, has a similar bulge, very similar to the US LTD as I mentioned previously. You also have kind of the typical Ford styling, flat fenders, and fill the box, if you want to call it styling. In other words, very square, slab-sided overall surfacing. And that was just typical of Ford in the US, and I guess that styling philosophy also translated to Australia. I will say the bumper guards on this ZH Fairlane do remind me of those on the AMC Ambassador with their kind of pointiness. But, well, let me know if you agree or disagree with that. In any case, the Ford LTD P6, as I mentioned, was based on this ZH Fairlane, but it was a whole nother level of tacky styling. And I actually like the ZH Fairlane styling a little bit. But the Ford LTD P6 is, well, just not my cup of tea. But it's clear what the inspiration was. No, it wasn't the Chrysler Cordoba, which you can definitely see in the front end of the styling in this picture here. Remember, though, that the Cordoba was actually based on Jaguar styling, for those who are English. And take a look here at a Cordoba juxtaposed with a Jaguar XJ of the era. Clearly, they got a little bit of inspiration from that. But in addition to those Jaguar-style headlights, the Ford also took inspiration from the Rolls-Royce grille, and you can clearly see that up front. Now, in the United States, Ford was also taking inspiration from Rolls-Royce with a couple vehicles, in particular the Lincoln Mark III and the Lincoln Mark IV. When Lincoln introduced the Mark III based on the four-door Thunderbird, it was alleged that Lee Iacocca effectively told Gene Bourdonnais and the design team that he wanted a Thunderbird with a Rolls-Royce grille on the front end. And despite the designers really hating that assignment, they succeeded and the car was extremely successful. So I guess Ford of Australia decided to replicate that success formula by trying to put that Rolls-Royce grille and a Jaguar-esque front end on this LTD P6. I'm not quite sure it's all that successful of a treatment, but hey, Ford sold 6,000 of these LTD P6s, and that's not horrible. Remember that the population of Australia is roughly a tenth of the United States, so selling 6,000 in Australia would be the equivalent of selling 60,000 in the U.S. Not great, but remember, this is a full-size car in a market that really didn't purchase a lot of full-size cars. So overall, okay sales, I would say. Now, despite that English-ish front end, the rest of the styling is actually pretty American, I would say, from the overall relatively flat sides to the formal-like C-pillar, relatively upright backlight that you can see. You have the flow-through ventilation system exhausting out through vents in the C-pillar. And the deck lid, the tail lamp treatment, and even the wheel covers, notice, are very similar to U.S. Mercury Marquis wheel covers of the era. You also got some U.S.-like hardware, including the flush door handles, which by this point in the U.S., for whatever reason, Ford had generally shifted to door handles that were no longer flush, but Australia kept this style door handle for some time. The U.S.-based items really continued under hood with an engine that was produced in Australia but was derived in the U.S., and that was the 5.8-liter, 351 cubic inch Ford V8 that was very typical from the time. And the acceleration on these P6 LTDs was not too shabby for the era. 0 to 60 or 0 to 100 kilometers an hour took a little over 10 seconds or so, which really wasn't bad for the time. Now, overall, one would say that the styling on the outside of the vehicle was rather luxurious. But let's talk for a moment about the town car option, which was apparently installed on just about 400 of the 6,000 LTD P6s. But take a look at this awesome interior, and what do you think of that? This is a melange of not just U.S. and English, but maybe even Italian styling a little bit, dare I say. This dash with the tons of wood grain is unfortunately all fake as compared to the Jaguar dashes, which were always real wood. But notice that it looks quite handsome and tasteful, and you'll even see a few bits of U.S. hardware like the vents, which appear to have been stolen from Lincoln. It also appears that Ford of Australia liked the Mercury Marquis logo because they placed it in a few areas on the car, on the C-pillar as well as the steering wheel, this kind of flattish two-spoker that I don't recall seeing in the United States. It's a rather, uninteresting affair. Now, on the center console, you can see there are the HVAC controls. You have a typical Ford-style shifter. I think one of the things that's interesting about this Ford shifter is that in the U.S., you'd be sitting on the left-hand side of the interior versus the right-hand side, so your thumb would be in the location where it would depress that little button to change the gears. But they apparently didn't reverse the shifter design, and so here your pinky finger or your ring finger is actually depressing that button to move the gear selector out of park. Moreover, if we look at the interior seats, they kind of appear to be a mix of Ford high-back bucket seats or high-back bench seats from the early 1970s, coupled with Ford Thunderbird seats of the era, coupled with perhaps even Maserati a little bit, that had these overstuffed leathery pillows that you would sit on. They appear to be very comfortable, and I would guess that they are. I've actually never sat in one of these Ford ZH LTDs, but, it looks quite nice on the inside. Even the door panel appears to be nicely trimmed with some fake wood as well as soft touch plastics. Now, to my knowledge, all of these town cars were equipped with power windows as well as air conditioning. That came standard, makes sense in the land down under. But it took a little while for power seats to become standard. They weren't standard from the get-go. Nonetheless, this was clearly a luxurious car. You even got lights in the bottom of the door panels just to give you a little bit of a flare at nighttime. From a chassis perspective, these LTD P6s are relatively uninteresting. They have coil springs up front, leaf springs in the rear, although they do have a four-wheel disc brake setup that came standard with the vehicle, as well as a limited slip differential and variable ratio power steering. Now, in the U.S., Ford really didn't have variable ratio power steering. That was something that GM often used in its steering boxes, and I wonder if this steering gear was procured from General Motors, because I can't think of a Ford variable ratio unit in the U.S., but perhaps there was a local steering gear that was produced in Australia, although I highly doubt it. As a consequence of its tried and true powertrain, which, as I mentioned, comprised the 351 cubic inch V8, heavy-duty automatic as well as a 9-inch rear end. These LTDs were known as very durable vehicles. Unfortunately, as was the case in the U.S., rust certainly took its toll, and these cars did rust in a number of areas, just like, well, really anything from the era. But if you were looking for something that was highly luxurious and atypical for the time period, this Ford LTD P6 town car, I would say, is one of the best, certainly from the Australian market, but just a cool car overall. I have to just remind the reader of the interior again, because I think it's just an interesting mix of American taste with English taste and maybe even, as I mentioned, Italian taste. Even that center console that's super padded and trimmed looks very Italian to me. So Ford designers were having a bit of fun during this era, and I guess who could blame them? It was the tacky 1970s, even in Australia. Well, let me know what you think of this Ford P6 LTD town car. I think it's a pretty sweet vehicle overall, but I would appreciate a comment in the comments section. And be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and the super thanks if you really enjoyed the video.